In 1943, during one of his most urgent prophetic readings, Edgar Cayce warned that America would face a spiritual collapse long before any physical catastrophe, a deterioration of values so profound that it would threaten the nation's very foundation. He saw a pattern. Nations fall not from external enemies, but from internal spiritual decay. And right now, across every sector of American society, the exact signs Cayce identified are manifesting with undeniable clarity. The erosion of community bonds, the worship of material success over moral integrity, the normalization of dishonesty in leadership, the explosion of spiritual emptiness masked by distraction, these aren't random social problems. They're the precise sequence Cayce said would mark the beginning of America's spiritual reckoning. The question isn't whether his prophecy was accurate. The question is, are you spiritually prepared for what comes when a nation loses its soul? Have you noticed these patterns accelerating in your own community, your own life? Share your observations in the comments, because recognizing this pattern is the first step toward conscious response. Edgar Cayce didn't predict America's downfall through war or natural disaster. He predicted something far more insidious, a spiritual collapse that would hollow out the nation from within, leaving only the facade of greatness while the foundation crumbled. During his prophetic readings throughout the 1930s and 1940s, he repeatedly warned that America's greatest threat wasn't external. It was the gradual abandonment of the spiritual principles upon which the nation was founded. He saw a future where material success would be worshipped above all else, where truth would become negotiable, where community would fracture into isolated individualism, and where the pursuit of pleasure would replace the pursuit of purpose. What makes Cayce's prophecy so unsettling today isn't that it predicted dramatic catastrophe. It's that it predicted exactly the quiet erosion we're witnessing right now, in ways so normalized we barely recognize them as symptoms of collapse. Cayce was explicit about the mechanism of this collapse. He explained that nations, like individuals, operate under spiritual law, the law of cause and effect, karma applied at the collective level. When a nation is founded on principles of service, community, and spiritual growth, it prospers not just materially, but in ways that nourish the soul of its people. But when a nation abandons those founding principles, when it prioritizes accumulation over contribution, when it elevates self-interest above collective well-being, when it treats truth as malleable and morality as inconvenient, it sets in motion a karmic consequence that manifests as internal decay. Cayce saw this pattern repeated throughout history. Egypt, Rome, Greece, Atlantis, all civilizations that rose through spiritual alignment and fell through spiritual abandonment. He warned that America, despite its unique promise, was not exempt from this universal law. The spiritual choices made collectively would determine whether the nation evolved or dissolved. The signs Cayce identified weren't subtle. He spoke of a time when Americans would become so focused on personal comfort and entertainment that they would ignore the deterioration of their communities. He warned of a period when truth would be treated as relative, when leaders would lie openly and citizens would accept it as normal, when institutions meant to serve the public would serve only themselves. He described a society where genuine human connection would be replaced by superficial interaction, where people would feel profoundly alone despite being constantly connected, where spiritual emptiness would be medicated with consumption rather than addressed through inner work. He warned of a collective amnesia about purpose, where Americans would forget why the nation was created, what values it was meant to embody, and what responsibility came with the privilege of freedom. These weren't vague predictions. They were specific patterns Cayce said would signal that America had crossed a spiritual threshold from which recovery would require profound collective awakening. Now look around. Observe what's happening in American society with clear eyes. The worship of wealth has reached religious proportions. Success is measured almost exclusively in financial terms, and those who accumulate the most are celebrated regardless of how they obtained it or what they contribute. Community bonds have fractured to historic lows. People live next to neighbors whose names they don't know, in towns where civic participation has collapsed, within families where members communicate through screens rather than face-to-face. The normalization of dishonesty in leadership is staggering. Politicians lie, get caught, and face no meaningful consequence because the public has become numb to it. Media outlets prioritize profit over truth, shaping narratives to increase engagement rather than inform accurately. Institutions that were designed to serve the collective good, education, healthcare, government, have been captured by private interests that extract value rather than create it. The spiritual emptiness is epidemic. Depression, anxiety, and addiction rates have skyrocketed despite material abundance that previous generations couldn't imagine. Americans are wealthier, more connected technologically, and more distracted than ever, yet report feeling more isolated, purposeless, and hopeless. The average person spends hours daily consuming content designed to trigger dopamine hits while providing zero nourishment to the soul. Genuine spiritual seeking has been replaced by spiritual consumerism. People collecting practices and philosophies like products, seeking quick enlightenment, while avoiding the difficult inner work that real transformation requires. The idea that life might have meaning beyond personal pleasure and success has become almost countercultural. This isn't random social dysfunction. This is the exact pattern of spiritual collapse Cayce warned would precede America's reckoning. The acceleration is what should get your attention. These patterns didn't emerge yesterday. They've been building for decades, but the rate of deterioration has increased dramatically in recent years. The things that used to shock us no longer do. The behaviors that used to be shameful are now normalized. The standards that used to hold are now dismissed as outdated. We've become accustomed to constant crisis, to institutional failure, to leadership incompetence, to social fragmentation. We've adapted to living in a state of low-level chaos and called it normal. But adaptation to dysfunction is not the same as health. When a society stops being outraged by corruption, stops being shocked by cruelty, stops expecting integrity from its institutions, that's not maturity. That's the numbness that precedes collapse. And Cayce was clear, this numbness, this spiritual anesthesia, is itself a sign that the collapse is already underway. The parallel to Rome is instructive. The Roman Empire didn't fall in a day. It decayed over centuries, and the people living through that decay didn't recognize it as collapse. They thought it was just how things were. Bread and circuses kept the population distracted while the foundations crumbled. Leadership became corrupt, but as long as entertainment flowed and basic needs were met, citizens didn't demand better. The military expanded to protect an empire that had already lost its soul. Economic inequality reached grotesque levels, with a tiny elite controlling vast wealth while the masses struggled, yet the system persisted because people had forgotten they had the power to demand change. The final collapse, when it came, seemed sudden to those living through it, but historians looking back could see the pattern clearly. Rome fell spiritually long before it fell politically. The physical collapse was just the final manifestation of an internal death that had been occurring for generations. Cayce warned that America was following the exact same trajectory. He also referenced Atlantis repeatedly in his readings about America's future, and the parallel is even more direct. According to Cayce, Atlantis was a civilization of tremendous technological and material advancement, but it fell because spiritual wisdom did not keep pace with technological power. The Atlanteans developed capabilities they weren't spiritually mature enough to handle responsibly. They prioritized power over wisdom, convenience over consequence, individual gratification over collective well-being. They used their knowledge for domination rather than service. And the result wasn't just the fall of a civilization. It was a cataclysm that reshaped the planet. Cayce saw America developing the same imbalance: extraordinary technological and material capability coupled with spiritual immaturity. He warned that if Americans didn't consciously choose spiritual growth to match their material advancement, they would repeat Atlantis's pattern, not necessarily in the same physical way, but through the same spiritual mechanism of power without wisdom leading to self-destruction. What's crucial to understand is that Cayce's prophecy wasn't deterministic. He didn't say America must collapse. He said America would collapse if it continued on its current trajectory, if it continued prioritizing materialism over spirituality, if it continued fracturing community in favor of individualism, if it continued treating truth as negotiable and morality as inconvenient. The prophecy contained an implicit choice: recognize the pattern and change course, or continue unconsciously and face the consequences. This is where individual responsibility enters the collective equation. A nation is not an abstract entity separate from its people. A nation is the aggregate of individual consciousness and choices. When Cayce warned about America's spiritual collapse, he was warning about what happens when millions of individuals collectively abandon spiritual principles in favor of material comfort and personal pleasure. And conversely, he indicated that the collapse could be averted, or at least navigated consciously, if enough individuals chose differently. So what does that mean practically? What is the spiritual preparation Cayce emphasized when he spoke about navigating times of collective transition? It's not about stockpiling resources or finding the safest location. It's not about political activism or attempting to reform broken institutions. Those things may have their place, but they're not the core work. The core work is internal transformation that then radiates outward into how you live and interact. Cayce was consistent. In times of collective spiritual crisis, the individuals who navigate it best are those who have done the inner work to align with spiritual law, those who have developed a relationship with the divine that is direct and personal rather than mediated by institutions, those who have cultivated inner peace that isn't dependent on external circumstances, those who have learned to act from love and service rather than fear and self-interest. This means examining honestly where you've compromised your own integrity in service of comfort or success. Where have you participated in the very patterns of materialism, dishonesty, and disconnection that you recognize as symptoms of collapse? Where have you chosen distraction over presence, consumption over contribution, convenience over consciousness? This isn't about guilt, it's about clear seeing. You cannot be part of the solution while unconsciously perpetuating the problem. The spiritual preparation Cayce emphasized starts with radical honesty about your own complicity in the collective dysfunction, followed by concrete choices to live differently, not performatively, not to signal virtue to others, but because you recognize that your individual choices are your participation in either the collapse or the potential renewal. Cayce was also clear about the role of community. One of the signs of spiritual collapse he identified was the fragmentation of genuine community, people living in isolation, trusting no one, operating purely from self-interest. And he indicated that those who would navigate the transition successfully would be those who actively worked against this fragmentation by building authentic bonds of mutual support and shared purpose. Not online communities of like-minded people reinforcing each other's beliefs, but real, local, face-to-face communities where people of different backgrounds and perspectives come together around shared service and genuine care for each other's well-being. In times of collapse, those who survive and thrive are those who remember they're part of something larger than themselves and act accordingly. The choice Cayce presented is ultimately between two responses to recognizing the pattern of collapse: fear-based reaction or consciousness-based response. Fear drives people to grasp, to hoard, to protect only their own, to view the world as hostile and everyone as competition. Fear breeds the very fragmentation and self-interest that accelerates collapse. Consciousness, on the other hand, recognizes that collapse of dysfunctional systems creates space for something new to emerge, but only if enough people are spiritually prepared to build differently. Consciousness chooses to be a stabilizing presence in chaos rather than adding to it. Consciousness prioritizes inner peace and outer service even when, especially when, the world seems to be falling apart. This is the spiritual preparation that matters, not being immune to the consequences of collective choices, but being aligned enough internally that you can respond rather than react, serve rather than grasp, love rather than fear. When the external structures Americans have relied on become unreliable, when economic systems fail to provide security, when institutions fail to serve their stated purpose, when social cohesion continues to fracture, the people who will be okay are not those with the most resources or the best bunkers. They're the people who have developed internal resources, resilience, clarity, compassion, connection to something larger than ego. They're the people who have remembered that life's purpose isn't comfort and accumulation, but growth and contribution. They're the people who have done the work to align with spiritual law so that when external chaos intensifies, they remain internally grounded. This isn't about being special or superior, it's about being prepared in the way that actually matters. If you're feeling the acceleration of dysfunction, if you're recognizing the patterns Cayce warned about manifesting around you, if you're sensing that we're approaching some kind of threshold, that sensing is accurate. You're not paranoid or catastrophizing. You're observing clearly what's actually happening. The question is what you do with that recognition. Do you numb yourself back into distraction because the truth is uncomfortable? Do you spiral into despair because the problems feel too big? Or do you use this recognition as a wake-up call to get serious about your own spiritual alignment, to stop participating unconsciously in the patterns of collapse, to start building in your own life and community the values and connections that could seed renewal? The prophecy isn't just about what's coming, it's about who you choose to be as it unfolds. If you recognize these patterns in America today, the spiritual emptiness, the worship of material success, the normalization of dishonesty, the fragmentation of community, hit that like button and subscribe, because this channel is dedicated to connecting the prophetic wisdom of Edgar Cayce to the observable reality of our times. We're not here to sugarcoat or sensationalize, we're here to observe clearly and prepare consciously. And speaking of preparation, drop a comment sharing what shifts you're making in your own life as you recognize these patterns. How are you choosing consciousness over fear? How are you building authentic community? Your insights might be exactly what someone else needs to hear to take their first step towards spiritual preparation. America's spiritual collapse, as Cayce saw it, is not punishment from an angry God. It's consequence from violated spiritual law, the natural result of a nation collectively choosing materialism over meaning, distraction over depth, individual gratification over collective responsibility. But here's what gives this prophecy hope even in its darkness. Spiritual law also means that different choices produce different outcomes. A nation's trajectory can shift when enough individuals shift. Collapse is not inevitable if consciousness increases. The pattern can change if enough people recognize it and choose differently. You are not powerless in this. Your individual spiritual choices contribute to the collective field. When you choose truth over comfortable lies, when you choose genuine connection over superficial interaction, when you choose service over self-interest, when you choose consciousness over distraction, you're not just improving your own life, you're shifting the collective pattern, even if only incrementally. Cayce's prophecy about America carries the same message as all his prophetic work. We are not victims of fate. We are creators through consciousness. What manifests collectively is the aggregate of what we choose individually. A society becomes what its people value. A nation embodies what its citizens prioritize. If we collectively value only comfort, wealth, power, and pleasure, we get a society organized around those values, and it will eventually consume itself because those values are not sustainable. But if enough of us value truth, service, community, and spiritual growth, we create the foundation for something different to emerge. The collapse Cayce warned about is happening. The signs are undeniable, but the outcome is still being written by the choices we make now, individually and collectively. The hardest part of this prophecy to accept is that there's no cavalry coming. No leader is going to save America from spiritual collapse. No political movement or social reform or technological innovation is going to address the core issue. The core issue is spiritual. It's about what people value, what they prioritize, how they treat each other, whether they remember there's more to existence than material accumulation and personal pleasure. And spiritual problems require spiritual solutions. That means the work is personal. It's you examining your own life, your own choices, your own alignment with spiritual law. It's you deciding what kind of person you want to be as the world around you becomes increasingly chaotic. It's you choosing to be a source of stability, clarity, and compassion when everyone around you is reacting from fear. That's not glamorous work. It's not going to make you rich or famous. But it's the work that matters. It's the work that will determine whether you navigate this transition consciously or get swept along by the current of collective unconsciousness. Cayce saw two Americas emerging from this period of spiritual collapse, not geographically divided, but spiritually separated. One America would continue clinging to the old paradigm of materialism and self-interest, becoming increasingly desperate and destructive as that paradigm failed to deliver what it promised. The other America would be formed by those who use the collapse as an opportunity to remember what actually matters, who let the dissolution of dysfunctional systems free them to build differently, who recognize that the end of one way of living could be the beginning of another. He saw these two Americas existing simultaneously, interacting but fundamentally operating from different values and consciousness. The question isn't which America will prevail externally. The question is, which America you're building internally and in your immediate community through your daily choices. There's a sequence Cayce described that's worth understanding clearly. First comes the recognition, the moment when enough people see the pattern of spiritual collapse clearly enough that they can no longer deny it. We're in that phase now for those who are paying attention. Second comes the choice, each individual deciding whether to continue participating in the dysfunction or to align differently. That's the phase we're entering. Third comes the separation, not a physical dividing of the nation, but a divergence of consciousness, where people living in the same towns operate from completely different values and realities. And finally comes either renewal or final collapse, depending on whether enough people chose consciousness in phase 2. We can't skip steps. Recognition must precede choice. Choice must precede separation. And what emerges from the separation depends entirely on the cumulative weight of individual choices made during the window of opportunity between recognition and consequence. You're living in that window right now. The recognition phase has occurred. If you're watching this, you've recognized the pattern. The choice phase is open. Every day, every interaction, every decision is an opportunity to choose alignment with spiritual law over participation in collective dysfunction. But this window won't stay open indefinitely. There comes a point where the momentum of collapse becomes too strong to redirect, where the consequences of decades of poor choices become unavoidable, regardless of course correction. Cayce was clear. There is a threshold beyond which recovery requires catastrophe rather than awakening. America may already be past that threshold collectively, but individuals and communities are not. You can still choose. Your circle can still choose. Your family can still choose. The collapse of the larger system doesn't have to mean your personal collapse if you've built your foundation on spiritual bedrock rather than material sand. What would Edgar Cayce say to Americans today if he could address us directly? Based on his readings, he would say, "Stop waiting for someone else to fix what's broken. Stop looking to leaders or institutions or movements to solve problems that are fundamentally spiritual. Look in the mirror. Examine your own life. Where are you compromising integrity for convenience? Where are you prioritizing material comfort over spiritual growth? Where are you contributing to the fragmentation and dysfunction you claim to oppose? Start there. Fix yourself first. Align your own life with the spiritual principles you claim to believe. And then, only then, radiate that alignment outward through how you treat others, how you participate in community, how you make decisions, how you spend your time and resources. The prophecy of America's collapse is not about inducing hopelessness. It's about inducing the kind of honest self-examination that precedes transformation. Nations transform when enough individuals transform. It's always worked that way. It's the only way it works. The signs are here. The pattern is clear. The spiritual collapse Cayce warned about is manifesting across every dimension of American society. You can see it if you're willing to look honestly. The question is no longer whether the prophecy was accurate. Events have confirmed that. The question is what you do with this recognition. Do you use it as motivation to get right with yourself spiritually? Do you use it as a catalyst to stop participating unconsciously in the patterns of collapse? Do you use it as an invitation to start building, in your own life and immediate community, the kind of values-based existence that could seed renewal? Or do you let the recognition depress you into passivity, numb you back into distraction, or radicalize you into the kind of fear-based reaction that only accelerates the dysfunction? The choice is yours. The time to choose is now. The prophecy is unfolding. Your role in it is still being determined by the consciousness you bring to each moment. Make it count.